Thank you to everyone joining us today from across the country and around the world. I'm Kim Todd, Virtual Programs Manager here at Conscious Capitalism Inc. On behalf of the entire CCI team, we appreciate you taking the time to learn and grow in community with us. Today, we are excited to welcome our board member and CEO of Jump Associates, Dave Patnaik, and former CEO of Medtronic and current professor at Harvard Business School, Bill George. About Bill's new book. Bill and Dave are going to be talking about Bill's new book, True North, the Emerging Leaders Edition. We're going to learn a little bit more about what it's going to take for emerging leaders to turn challenges into the inspiration needed to accomplish extraordinary things, and approaches to help develop conscious leaders who lead with self-awareness, values, and higher purpose. As many of you know, conscious capitalism is a philosophy that emphasizes the human nature of business, as well as a movement of business leaders from around the world working to change the practice and perception of capitalism as a means to elevate humanity. Conscious Capitalism Inc. is a nonprofit organization dedicated to catalyzing that movement by creating learning opportunities like today's session and building systems of support for practicing conscious capitalists through our Senior Leader Network membership and engagement with our local chapters. Several times a month, we offer virtual gatherings as a way for the community to see how this philosophy takes shape in the leadership journeys and the business practices of those in our network. Today's gathering will run for about 45 minutes. Dave and Bill will be in conversation for about 25 to 30 minutes, and then we'll transition to audience questions during the last portion of our session. We encourage you to use the Q&A box found at the bottom of your screen, and we'll try to get to as many of your questions as we can during our time together. If you have any technical questions or issues, please email us at info@consciouscapitalism.org. Now I'm honored to welcome Dave Patnaik and Bill George. Thank you both so much for being here. Dave is the CEO of Jump Associates, a Conscious Capitalist Inc. board member, and author himself of the book Wired to Care: How Companies Prosper When They Create Widespread Empathy, and an adjunct professor at Stanford University. Dave, you and Bill clearly have quite a bit in common. It's going to be a great conversation. I'm going to hand it over to you to introduce Bill and get the conversation going. Thanks again for being here.
Thank you so much, Kim. I am so excited to have this conversation today. Most of you know Bill George. About 20 years ago, Bill wrote the book Authentic Leadership, which really was the first book to really describe what it meant to be a leader in the 21st century, wildly different, coming from a place of true authenticity and in being in touch with your own values. Shortly thereafter, he wrote one of my favorite books of all time, which is True North, really a guide to talk about how do you build self-awareness, how do you establish clear values, how do you seek that kind of intrinsic meaning and really commit yourself to an enduring purpose to make a difference in the world. Bill has most recently followed up with True North, an emerging leader edition for the next generation, and we're going to get into that. Most of you also know that Bill was the CEO of Medtronic for a number of years, so he's not speaking purely from theory, but actual experience. And for the last number of years, he's been a professor and a fellow at Harvard Business School, which candidly I have not heard of, but I'm told it's a place similar to what we do here at Stanford. Bill, how are you? It's so good to see you again.
Dave, thank you for having me on. It's exciting to be back. I'm glad to see this conscious capitalism movement really flourishing right now. I remember it was a decade ago that John Mackey called me and asked me if I would write a foreword to his new book called Conscious Capitalism. And as I wrote then, I said, this is the book I always wanted to write, because he kind of brought all together the things I believed about capitalism and how a company should be run. And I think there's no better economic tool than capitalism to build jobs, to build people. But one has to take into account all the stakeholders, as John did. So I'm thrilled to see how this work has really expanded over the last 9 years.
Yeah, absolutely. And talk about this emerging leader edition. What compelled you to say, look, we need a whole new edition. This is not just a reprint of True North, but we need to make it relevant to a whole nother generation.
We are going through a massive change in leadership right now. From the baby boomers who have been in charge for the last 30 years, to the emerging leaders that I define as Gen X, Millennials, and Gen Z. I know a little bit less about Gen Z because they are learning about what they want. But I do think this is more than just a time change. And more than just a generation change. It's really a change in leadership. Mm-hmm. And I think it was very symbolic that 3 years ago, when the Business Roundtable, composed the 250 largest companies in America, made the decision to shift from shareholder primacy to the multi-stakeholder model, which is very close to conscious capitalism. They really adopted the conscious capitalism model, or model, not motto. And but I think today, unfortunately, a lot of the baby boomers leaders are still in the old mode. They're still thinking about earnings per share. They're thinking about purely satisfying the stock market. What's my stock price? What's my net worth? And really haven't made the change. And I think the newer leaders coming on board are embracing this. In fact, they don't want to work for your company unless you're a conscious capitalist. They ask you questions like, what's your purpose? What are your values? Do you have a climate change plan? Do you have a diversity and inclusion plan? So I think there's a big change taking place in leadership, and I welcome, more than welcome, I'm urging it.
Mm-hmm. I see a lot of CEOs who are struggling with this. Candidly, that it was eminently clear immediately after the murder of George Floyd, where you had so many CEOs who felt the need to say something. But they're in their 50s and 60s and didn't learn how to be vulnerable as a leader. When they came up in their 20s and 30s, they learned how to manage a P&L, and they learned how to speak in that kind of old school commanding way. And suddenly you wake up and now you have to be vulnerable at the age of 55, and it's a completely new skill set for them.
I think you should be vulnerable at 25. But setting that aside, I think it is speaking out on public issues is the number one issue I hear from CEOs. But let me give you an example of someone who does that exceptionally well, who actually is a baby boomer, Chip Bergh, who's CEO of Levi Strauss. And I feature him in my last chapter on the moral leader, because he is in truth a moral leader who's led by his values and follows his moral compass. But Chip said very honestly and openly, after George Floyd's murder, he went back and looked at the progress that Levi's was making in diversity. He said, I was extremely disappointed we weren't making more progress. And we had a long way to go. And he instituted a lot of plans and programs, and now he's making far greater progress. But that's the kind of introspective look and honest look that I think all CEOs should be taking, looking at their companies. Why is it that we talk about diversity all the time and we don't have any women in top leadership roles? We don't have any Blacks or BIPOC leaders. We don't have any foreign-born leaders. Why is that? And I think they really have to look themselves in the mirror and say, maybe it's something I'm doing. It starts with me, and I think that's what Chip did.
Yeah, I think, and Chip's story is a great one. What do you do? I mean, we see so many companies who are trying to stand up for their values now and are getting hammered from both sides. And, probably the most interesting example that we can learn from is what's gone on with Disney, where after the education bill in Florida that some people call it like don't say gay, you had all of Disney's employees who came out and said, you have to take a stand. And then you had the government of the state of Florida hammer Disney and take away its tax status, right? So you're damned if you do, damned if you don't, right? Like, how do you navigate that?
Well, let's go to the backstory. Let's go deeper into it. Yeah. Bob Chapek, the new CEO, got there at age 60, now 62. He succeeded Bob Iger, who was one of the great CEOs of the world, not just of America, and who had done a brilliant job really building Disney. He was always out there with his customers, his people, the partners he got to bring in, like Marvel Productions, George Lucas. Amazing, all these people he brought in.
Truly a servant leader, Bob Iger.
Yeah, a real servant leader. And then Bob Chapek comes in. He said, I'm not going to comment on any of these issues. He just got to put my head down. I'm going to run the business. Well, Disney is one of the most public, Dave, of all companies. And they've had an image since I was a little boy. I said to my mother, oh, isn't it wonderful what Walt Disney's given the world? She said, well, son, they're making a lot of money doing it. But I said, that's fine as long as I get my Mickey Mouse Club. But in all seriousness, I think that Bob Chapek missed the boat, and he didn't declare where he stood. And he cut a deal with Governor DeSantis. This is the backstory. For $600 million to move 10,000 or 20,000 people from Burbank, California to Orlando, Florida. Did he talk to the employees he was asking, the executives asking? No. And yeah, there was a lot of pushback. And when they pushed through the parental rights bill, which, as you properly said, was being called the Don't Say Gay bill, that raised the hackles on some people's back. But whatever you want to call the bill, did it make gay people feel like they're welcome in Florida? And was he going to transfer a lot of people from California where they knew they were welcome? So then he got a tremendous amount of pushback from his LGBTQ employees, and not just from them, all the people that supported them. See, you have to realize there are an awful lot of us that are not gay that are supporting the rights of people in the LGBTQ identity. So I think that, that then he changed the position midstream. See, I think if you're going to speak on a public issue, or you're going to have public issue, you got to decide what is your mission, what are your values, and when it cuts into that, you better speak out. Back to the George Floyd, any CEO in Minneapolis that not only didn't speak out, but didn't have a clear position on the inclusion of their BIPOC employees here in Minneapolis after George Floyd's murder was not going to make it. And of course, they all did speak out. So I think it, and so, yeah, then he got himself caught in a political maelstrom. But, if he had taken a position before, I'll give you another example. Georgia passed some voting laws that some people consider are making it more difficult for people of color to vote. You can debate that. But Ed Bastian at Delta spoke out, and he had said earlier, Delta's values are not for sale. He spoke out very forcefully against that. And he had a lot of courage to do that, whereas Craig Manier at Home Depot said nothing. And I think you have to decide. He decided this was really important to Delta employees. They needed to have him as a spokesperson. Today's millennial generation doesn't want to work for your company, Dave, unless you know where you stand on these important issues.
Yeah, one of the things I love about, all of your books, but the latest one in particular is you give a very clear framework on what leaders need to do, but you also tell so many stories, and they almost read like parables, right? That we can kind of take lessons from. And you are not afraid to call out, Elizabeth Holmes of Theranos is an easy one, but Mark Zuckerberg, and I'll just read you from one thing. Here's just one paragraph. It says, what do the former CEOs of McDonald's, Intel, Hewlett-Packard, Best Buy, and Boeing have in common? Steve Easterbrook, Brian Krasnich, Mark Hurd, Brian Dunn, and Harry Stodenseifer all violated their company's values by having inappropriate relationships with company employees. Man, you're not afraid to call people out when they're not living up to their word, huh?
I'd like to ask them, what are you guys thinking? We treat new CEOs in a program I run at Harvard. We've had about 400 CEOs go through there. We got 13 coming up in a couple of weeks. We limited to 12 or 13 people. But I always ask them, I said, you are a public figure, like it or not. You may not like it, but what you say really matters. Your relationships matter. Your values, your behavior needs to be above reproach. You don't go to what the company standard is. You go higher. And you got to realize anything you do, maybe on Facebook or LinkedIn Live tomorrow, you never know. And so you just need to have that higher standard. And these guys went to a lower standard. I talked to the chairman of the board of Hewlett-Packard with Mark Hurd. He had no choice. They're going to violate our company values. Yeah, they have to leave. I talked to an Intel board member who's now chair of the board. Same thing. He wasn't there at the time, but he said, there's no question we had to do that because the boards have to uphold the values of the company. But doesn't the CEO, doesn't the leader, doesn't every leader, not just the CEO, every leader of the company needs to set the standard of values. And I'm not being moralistic about that. I'm just saying this is the kind of conduct you have to have. And today, by the way, if you don't, no one wants to work for you. And you'll not get the best employees.
Well, and this is fascinating, right? Because, you opened by talking about stakeholder capitalism, right? Mm-hmm. Which is, basically saying like, yes, we have to do right by shareholders, but also by employees and customers and partners and vendors and all of our stakeholders. Right. But it sounds like you are going much deeper to say something about aligning your personal North Star with the company's North Star and figuring out that connection. Right. And how does that play out? Because it seems like therein lies the challenge. Right.
Well, the reason I think we need more Gen X and millennial leaders right now is they understand that. They understand people don't want to work for a company unless they can align their personal purpose with the company's purpose. If the values don't match up. I worked for a company, the first decade of my business career, Litton Industries. It's now been acquired by somebody, but I started the consumer microwave oven business for them when there was no market and built it up. And we worked very hard on having good values. But then I learned the corporate values are very marginal. They were more or less cooking the books. And moving numbers around to make the numbers look good, and then it, like a house of cards, which it was, it all fell apart. The conglomerate model didn't work. But the important thing was I decided I couldn't work there. And at one time they wanted me to come to Beverly Hills, the corporate headquarters. I couldn't do that. I'm not going to, because when you buy into an organization whose values are at variance with your own, in the end, it won't work out. You're going to feel uncomfortable. So you need that alignment. And I think that is critical. And that's kind of all the way back to the Disney story. That's what the employees are calling out and saying, hey, are we not aligned anymore?
Yeah, there's a beautiful chart in your book, and it would take me 10 minutes to describe it. So I'm just going to put up a screen share of what I saw from it, because I think it's just beautiful. This is a chart where you had described the stories of several leaders, including the CEO of seventh generation and now Medtronic. And what you do is you show each leader, and then there's kind of a thermometer bar of alignment between that leader's personal true north and the company's true north. And it's fascinating. It is a journey that each of these leaders took to find the right context to connect their personal purpose to company purpose.
Well, John Rapogli is the first one there. It's really a great example. He was doing a great job at Guinness as a young man in his 30s. He had fantastic opportunity, but he realized, what's the problem with chemical dependency? And I think, if I'm not mistaken, he had a brother who had an alcohol problem. But he realized that, he loved the business, but he had to make a move. And then he went to Unilever, where Paul Pullman had come in and to put the focus on sustainability. And then he went on to Burt's Bees, where that was it all about. And he built the whole company around that. And then seventh generation, of course, is very, very sustainable products. And so good for him to make that transition, if you will, to follow what he really cares about. The same with Omar Ishrak, who I know very well because he was CEO of Medtronic, and he really rebuilt the company when it had fallen on some hard times. But he said he worked at GE for 16 years. And I said, Omar, what was the mission? Because Omar couldn't stop talking about the mission of Medtronic to restore people to full life and health. And he said, making money is the mission at GE. And I said, well, how can anyone get excited about that? It was in the employee ranks. Maybe the executives can. But
and the next generation who's coming up, they're looking at it in a very different way. I want to ask you about one person in particular who I find fascinating, and he's not in the book, but you and I have talked about Kim Clark, the dean of Harvard Business School, right? A devout Mormon, right?
mm-hmm.
And yet there was a kind of a divergence between his personal beliefs and his role as the dean of Harvard Business School. Can you just speak to that a little? Because I think it talks about this.
Well, I had great admiration for Kim. He invited me to come to Harvard Business School in 2004 as when I had been teaching in Switzerland to help launch a new course called Leadership and Corporate Accountability. It was really a post-Enron course on ethics and values, if you get cut to the core of the course. And Kim started it. He got top faculty. I had the privilege of working. One of whom didn't know her, became our dean, but fantastic faculty. But Kim, interesting enough, is a bishop of the Mormon Church in Massachusetts. As you know, the Mormon Church is very much opposed to any form of same-sex relations. Yet at Harvard Business School, my gay students told me, and it was true, that he was a strong funder of the LGBTQ movement. And he wanted to encourage students who might have been in the closet, might not have felt empowered, they could be who they were, to come out. And I think very much to his credit. So he could draw a line between his obligations as dean of the Harvard Business School, which represent all people, and at the same time, and his religious beliefs. And he had to carry out his obligations to the organization. And think of the trouble Harvard would have been if they'd been anti-gay, like some people feel that Florida's going.
Yeah, but I can imagine folks hearing this conversation and saying, Bill, What happened? You used to be a good salt of the earth Midwestern CEO. You moved to Boston and suddenly you got caught up in all this woke culture stuff. What are you doing?
Dave, tell me a definition of woke that you can just read Webster's and see if you can find it in there, because I don't know, it's now become a political football. Look,
Yeah.
I got more pushback over one experience I had at Medtronic. I didn't expect it, but I'd clearly been supporting our gay employees, and they wanted to form an association, which they did. And then the question came out about our foundation giving. Our foundation only has a policy.
This is while you're at Medtronic, yes.
Medtronic Foundation.
Yep.
And we gave 2% of our profits away, not gave away, but we invested them in local organizations. So the question came up, the Boy Scouts. The Boy Scouts got a Supreme Court decision, which has later been reversed, we know, to exclude gay scouts, gay scout masters. And we felt this was wrong. So we went to United Way and said, if we're going to continue giving you money, we have to be able to exclude the Boy Scouts. This lit off a firestorm, both within our organization and in the local newspapers, big headlines in the morning paper. But I was quite happy to stand behind it and say, I support all people being who they are. And yes, I love the Boy. People say, don't you like the Boy Scouts? Yeah, the Boy Scouts are a fantastic organization, but they can't exclude some 13-year-old boy because he thinks he might be gay. I mean, that's a horrible thing to do. And so I'm a great believer. I wrote in the book about inclusion. We have to include everyone for who they are, not what they are.
Yeah. Okay. Now I've asked you about the accusation of wokeness. I'll take the flip side. I can imagine that if I am a young 25-year-old, female person of color coming up, saying, "Oh gosh, why do I want to read this book and be lectured by some rich old white guy?"
Look at the content and look at who I'm quoting. There are a lot of Black females in the book, like Ursula Burns. Melody Hobson, who's chair of Starbucks, is going through a CEO change. So we're listening to what people are telling us, and there are a lot of diverse leaders. One of my favorite is Ken Frazier, who not only did an incredible job restoring Merck and bringing it back to its traditional values of medical research that saved lives, but he also had the courage after Charlottesville to make a very public statement that he was very upset by the president equivocating on values issues. And he said, we have to stand behind America. Every person is created equal. It's not a question of their color, their national origin, their gender, or their identity. And very powerful. And those are the people I really admire. So you don't have to listen to me. You can listen to the people in the book that are speaking directly, because all the quotes are approved by them. So it's not my opinion about them.
And the storytelling is really beautiful, I have to say. Do you when you look at the world where we are now, right? It really gives you an urgency. Your true north, and you say it in the book, is to develop authentic leaders.
Mm-hmm.
And
right.
There's no reason why you've done your big CEO stick. You've got the Harvard thing. You really have no reason to be working so hard at this point, and yet you are talking to as many people as you can about this need.
Well, it's clear, leaders make the difference between. I was talking to a group of institutional investors, and they were telling, what about stock price? I said, look at the leadership. Do they have integrity? Do they have character? Are they building an organization that's built on a solid foundation? We saw what happened to General Electric being destroyed because they didn't have a clear sense of mission and purpose. We saw what happened with Boeing because their leadership was not clear that airline safety or plane safety was the most important thing overall. They thought it was more about making money, and a great tragedy. But I think leaders make the difference. But I think we need a new generation of leaders that understand the values of the millennials and their people, and can really understand how to empower people and how to bring out the best in them. So that's been my goal, is try to help everyone that I'm in contact with, including the people on this webcast that I can't see, to reach your full potential, just like a good coach would. You need to reach your full potential. Use the gifts you've got to make this world a better place for everyone, not just for yourself, not just your family, but for everyone. And you pick an area you can make a difference and go to it.
I've been let's call myself a distant learning student of yours for 20 years. And I do see that an evolution where, 20 years ago, you were talking about authentic leadership. And the
Mhm.
last chapter in your current book is not authentic leadership, it's moral leadership.
Mhm.
I think there's a growth there that's occurred even in your thinking about what that means.
Or maybe I just had the courage to call it out now, because I think,
Interesting.
I don't want, when I say the moral leader in the last chapter, I'm not
Yeah.
talking about something moralistic or, you have to adopt this form of religion. Not at
Mhm.
all. I'm talking about you have to be grounded in your values and your sense of purpose. And that's
Yeah.
part of being the authentic you, knowing what's really important to you in life, and then grounding yourself in that and staying grounded. And so that's, I think, essential for everyone. And then you can become that moral leader that's willing to speak out, because today business leaders are more willing to speak out than ever before. And frankly, the public are looking to them. I remember back in 2009, if you look at the Edelman Trust Barometer, business leaders were at the lowest point on the barometer. Today, business leaders are the most trusted group of leaders in society. Now, why would that be? More trusted than doctors, teachers, people in the media? Why is that? In government, elected officials? It's because I think they now have the courage of their convictions, willing to speak out, but it's expected of them, as JP found out at Disney.
Yeah, that is always the question I had when I went back and I read Authentic Leadership, which is, how do I put it in the most gross terms? Osama bin Laden, no one can accuse him of inauthenticity. You don't spend decades in a cave and not really mean it, right? But there's something else you're speaking to beyond authentically adhering to your own values, as myopic as they may be. It seems like you are speaking to something much larger than that.
Well, yes, but also in the first book I wrote on authentic leadership was all about values. You need to have sound values that you're proud of. You don't want to sell your values because of your anger. You don't want to be evil. Osama bin Laden was clearly an evil person who had deep-seated anger. Maybe he should have dealt with his crucible instead of going out and killing people. And he seemed to take joy in killing people. And so, no, his values would never make it. And I'm saying, if you don't have solid values, I'm not going to tell you what your values should be, but I can tell you this: if you don't have solid, well-grounded values, and those cannot be grounded in evil or anger. And if your values, if you're listening in, if your values are anger and you want to get back at people, you need to reassess that. You're not born that way. You become that way because of events in your life. And so that's what I would say. Somebody said, wasn't Adolf Hitler authentic? No, he's not authentic. He dealt everything out of anger and hatred, and anti-Semitism, and other terrible things.
Is there, one thing I admire about you, Bill, is that you yourself are constantly learning or constantly growing. What is your growth edge now? What are what are the areas that you find that you are growing personally, as in all of this?
Dave, I'd say you ask great questions. I'm learning from you, from the questions you ask and the perspective you're bringing. I'm not trying to flatter you. I had somebody quiz me earlier about investors, give me a whole different perspective. But I'm learning from that. I think one of the people I feature in the book I really admire, perhaps the greatest business leader in the world today, is Sachin, Adella, CEO of Microsoft. People don't forget this, but when he took it over in 2014, Steve Ballmer had been CEO for 14 years, and the company was going straight downhill. They were going, I thought, the same direction as IBM did before Lou Gerstner came in. And, he totally revived the company. But more importantly, he said, went all the way back to when Ballmer took over. He said, we thought we were God's gift of creation, the highest market cap in the company in the world. And we were a bunch of know-it-alls. He said, we have to go from know-it-alls to learn-it-all. And if you want to work at Microsoft, you have to be continually learning. If you're not continually learning, maybe you should move on to another company, or maybe you should retire, because you have to be continually learning. This is how you stay young. I learned so much from my students. When I was teaching MBAs at Harvard, I would spend 2.5, 3 hours a day with students in my office. They weren't telling about my course, how they were doing. They wanted to know about their future. What did I do? Where should I devote my energies? What do I care about? And, and they want to talk about their crucibles, the difficult times they faced. Boy, I learned so much from them. So I never walk into a class, I don't know about you, Dave, where I don't expect to learn a lot more from my students than they learn from me. And it's been a great learning experience for me.
I think that's absolutely is the number one reason you should teach is so that you can learn something, right?
Very good. I like that.
Yeah, we're going to take some questions from folks in just a second. I just, one last question for you with all this. Are you optimistic about the way the world is going? Are you worried? What emotionally, where are you with all this?
Well, emotions go up and down. You can't be optimistic when Putin invades Ukraine and you look at the destruction in that country and you think, why are people quitting their jobs now in mass numbers? And I think one of the worst comments is the idea of quiet quitting. Why would you, as an employee, why would you quiet quit and just do the absolute minimum to get by? Why would you spend working for a company? Work is joy. As Colleen Gobran said, work is love made visible. That's a gift to your life. And so why would you do that? If you're unhappy with the organization, quit and go somewhere else, but don't do it quietly. So I think beyond that, though, I am very optimistic actually about the leadership coming up. And I think the new CEOs are fantastic. I think many of the boomer CEOs I feature in the book are really role models for the new CEOs. People like Paul Pullman, who I mentioned, Indra Nooyi, Ursula Burns, Mary Barra at General Motors, Corey Berry at Best Buy. They're just fantastic leaders, and Hubert, others that are really doing a good job. And now we see the younger leaders like Corey coming along, and that's why we feature a number of them in the book, Dave, to talk about who are these emerging leaders. And I wrote this book. I could only write it with a fantastic millennial named Zach Clayton, who is a tech entrepreneur who founded his own company back in 2009, who taught me everything about social media. So I learned more from Zach than he learned from me, that's for sure.
Oh, that's beautiful. We have so many questions coming in, and I apologize that we won't be able to hit all of them, but many of these questions are about your own personal values. And there's one from Kevin Rafferty that I just want to share, which says, one area I am concerned about is when a leader states their values only to find that they were manufactured so they can look good, fit in, and get what they want. What methods do you personally use? And this is to you personally to assess, determine your own personal values. What methods have you found that are most helpful to your CEOs to find their authentic values?
Well, first of all, today, particularly the millennials have a smell test. They can see right through that in about 60 seconds. And they're not going to tolerate working for somebody, this idea of purpose washing or values washing or just trying to say things and not do. They watch your actions. They really don't care what you say. They want to know, hey, here's the crunch. George Floyd's got murdered. What are we going to do about it? That's what they're watching. They're not just listening to what you say. They're certainly not listening to any statements coming out of the CEO's office or videos coming out or some out of the PR department. They want to know, where do you come? And that's why I think leaders have to be out with their people all the time, knowing their values, sharing their own. I spent about 30% of my time with employees at Medtronic and another 30% with customers because I felt I really wanted to learn from customers, and I really want to understand where our employers are coming from. Just walk into the lunchroom, or Ramon Lagarde does this, PepsiCo, just sit down a group of factory workers and say, hey, or office workers, what's going on? Tell me what's happening. That's where you learn those informal interactions. That's why I worry about all remote work. But I think it's that engagement level that's going to help you understand the people you work with.
Matt Stone asked, what needs to change in terms of leadership development to better incentivize and encourage the generation? Clearly, we have spent as a society billions of dollars at this point on leadership development over the last several decades, and we're still not there. So what are we doing wrong?
For a long time, we're teaching all the wrong things. We're teaching competency models. We're teaching charisma. We're teaching how to communicate, how to use your hands, and how to look good externally, how to dress for success. It's all nonsense. We need, and by the way, a lot of the management things at business schools, where you and I teach, and a lot of other business schools, are teaching managerial techniques are largely outmoded because of the rapidity of crises right now. It's hard to make a 10-year-long strategic plan when things are changing so rapidly. And so I think we need to teach leadership. And that's why all the courses I teach at Harvard that I've created there, as well as teach, are all about leadership. And they really are about helping you become a better leader. But you got to figure out it for yourself. No one can make you into a good leader. So I say, one of the things I say is you're like an athlete. You can have a coach, but you have to develop yourself into the best you can be at your expertise. And if your expertise is leadership, you're going to have to rub up against the world dealing with lots of different kinds of people, maybe living in different parts of the world to understand, as I did, what people are like in different parts of the world and understanding their cultures, and then how you blend that together in a unified whole for your organization. But until you do that, we got to start much earlier. We need to start in the 20s, in the 30s. Don't wait until you get into 40s to start developing leaders. That's what I heard at Honeywell. Well, people really don't develop to their 40s. This is nonsense. They develop much earlier. Give them the opportunity. Somebody gave me an opportunity at 27 to run the microwave division of Litton Industries. Start it. You know, who are we giving opportunities for? Look for people that raise their hand, are willing to do things, and give them a shot.
Do you find that your values have evolved if you compare it to yourself when you were, just starting out as the CEO of Medtronic to now? That it's not that you disagree with the values you had before, but other things have taken primacy in a way that weren't, at that time. Have your values evolved?
I had a very close friend, somewhat of like an older brother to me, once said, "Bill, your values have changed less than anyone I know." So I just feel like now is the time when you can be much more open. Look, in the 80s and 90s, I was very concerned about how things are going. I felt like you practically had to wear the armor, protect yourself against what was going on, because the values were so different. And I've always been kind of a contrarian in that regard. I'm going to be who I am. And I felt like I've tried to keep my values the same for the last 50 or 60 years. The values I have came from my mother, and I've tried to grow into them. I've had a lot of growth to do, but that's different than changing your values.
I love that. What? Yeah, there is an argument to be made, and Matthew Goetia, mentions this in the question. He says, "Why must business leaders engage in public policy? Wouldn't the capitalists allow the market to find the best solution without compromising returns, by alienating customers, by advocating our own policy positions?"
We have very flawed markets. What is the penalty for dumping a lot of pollution into the air? Zero. The healthcare market, one of our largest industries, totally flawed. There's no market mechanism because they passed a law. Now it's being reversed, that drug companies could charge whatever they wanted, and their customers couldn't negotiate. Their biggest customer couldn't negotiate with them. So there are a lot of flawed markets. So let's get over this idea of perfect capitalism. Capitalism without guardrails will fail. But I think it needs to have a higher purpose. That's what conscious capitalism brings, is a higher purpose to what you do. And if your company doesn't have a higher purpose other than making money, you will in the end fail. You may get to go several decades, but you will in the end fail. And today, the best leaders are not going to want to work for you. They don't want to work for a company. So you're not going to be able to attract the best millennials, the best Gen Zers to come to work for you unless you have clarity about these issues. So I feel very strongly about that. I'm a fervent capitalism. And I think one of the reasons people look into business leaders today is because capitalism is what creates all the wealth. I love philanthropy, and my wife and I try to give a lot of money away, but that's only because we made money through capitalism. And if you look at the money like Bill Gates is giving away, he got it through capitalism is the greatest wealth creator the world has ever known. But if you don't put guardrails on it, what happens is you get in real trouble, like Enron, WorldCom, all those phony companies got into. And then again in 2008, when I saw the banks collapsing, because they didn't have solid values. They were just trying to make money. And now in our era, the General Electrics of the world collapsing for the same reason. So be grounded in what you believe and bring people and attract people on that. Put the values out there. And if you believe everyone should have good health, then you darn well better have a good healthcare plan for your company that doesn't just look at fixing you when you get ill, but provides a lot of preventive tools.
We have a question that came in that talked about the revitalization of the labor movement and said, in the last 2 years, we have seen more unionizing happening than we've seen in 50 years, right? And the question is this a reflection of a failure of leadership, that because leaders weren't able to take into account the needs of everyone, unions are stepping back in? How should authentic leaders respond to employees who are looking to unionize?
Well, I'm extremely pro-employee, and I happen to think that we have ridden off the backs of our frontline employees. If we learn nothing more from COVID, It was the value of essential workers and the people on the front lines, where we can sit behind Zoom screens like we are today and have a good meeting. They were on the front line stocking shelves at Target, delivering a coffee at Starbucks, or delivering food to your home from DoorDash, or all these frontline people. My son's a frontline worker. He's a surgeon. He's not doing surgery from home. He's doing it there, and he's risking life because there are clearly people with COVID coming into his hospital. So that's what I think we realize the value, and we've underpaid the front line. Look at teachers, how they're underpaid. Nurses, I think we could do so much. So I think I'm very pro-employee. The union movement has been promoted pretty heavily by this administration. I think in many ways, for a non-union company to get a union, it represents a failure of leadership. And so I don't necessarily feel they need a third party. I've worked in an organization that have unions. You can work with them, although when the international union comes in, it's almost impossible. So I like to do what you can with the employees. Look at the Germans. They have an employee works council, or the Dutch, or the Belgians, where I live. They have employee works council. So you listen to the needs of your employees, whether you have a union or not. You have an employee works council, and of course, the Germans have co-determination with employees on the board. So, but I do think the failure of leadership, I think one of the reasons Howard Schultz came back into Starbucks is they were unionizing Starbucks. You got Amazon, it's kind of a sweatshop. So we'll see what happens. So I think it's a wake-up call. Today, on a broader basis, Dave, the employees have agency today, whether they're forming a union to express their agency, whether they're protesting Disney because the CEO won't defend them, they have agency. In our day, we just wanted to get a job. Today, anyone can get a job. It's a question, where do I want to devote my energies and my gifts? And that's the big difference. And that's why we need new leaders who understand that, not are operating in the old mode.
So I love that, just the idea that the game has changed, right? It's almost, what I hear you saying is, it's not do it because it's nice to do it because it's the only game in town now. Like the balance of power has really shifted, right?
Yep.
People are just happy to have a job. You have to give them a greater purpose, and you have to do it with authenticity, and you have to make sure that it's aligned with your own values as well.
And by the way, how many baby boomers were proud to take away the pensions from their employees and the health care away and move away from that? Shame on them. I mean, those General Electric workers, where they had moved from a pension to 401ks, and a lot of it, people kept it in GE stock, and the stock went to very, very, lost 80% of its value. But beyond that, the dividend went to a penny a share. They lost their livelihood, their retirement savings. So shame on that. To me, to use your cash to buy back stock instead of paying out a dividend to your shareholders is immoral.
Right, and you're saying this not as a activist on the front lines. You're talking as someone who is in the seat, right? Running a company. So these are not just theoretical ideas for you.
No, that's for sure. No, they come out of many discussions with CEOs and leaders at all levels, people starting out their careers all the way up to the C-suite, but an awful lot of mid-career people. So that's what I'm just listening and learning from them.
Yeah. Last question for you. If you're a 25-year-old coming up, looking at the world, maybe you work at a company, maybe you don't. What advice do you have for them as they're contemplating what to do next? Because I mean, they're the emerging leaders, right? Guys like you and I.
They are. You got it.
Yeah. What advice do you have for them?
Find a place in that organization. I'm assuming you went there because you thought the organization, you could relate to their end product, what they were doing, their values, their purpose. I'm assuming that. If that's not the case, rethink it. But then beyond that, find a place where you can make a difference and lead now. You don't have to have a title. You can lead right in place. I just came from a week in the national parks with a woman who is 27 years old. She's a fantastic leader, no direct reports, did an incredible job. You can see that quality. Don't wait till somebody taps you on the shoulder. Lead now. No job is too small to lead in. So if you get the opportunity, just go do it. Take advantage of that. And that's how you learn to lead. You don't learn by getting into a big office and working on an executive committee or getting into the C-suite. No, you learn by doing it. And those formative positions will affect you the rest of your life as a leader. What you learn today about leading people, leading people is not something that you're born with. It's not a question of the IQ. The smartest person does not make the best leader. It's a question of life of experience and rubbing up against the world and leading lots of different people with different values, different national origins, different, coming at things from a different. That's where you learn to lead. How do you lead different people? And by the way, if you get a chance to lead a volunteer organization, do it, because when you're leading a corporate organization, you're holding someone's paycheck. As a volunteer, everyone's there only because they believe in a common purpose. So think about that as well. Take the opportunities, maybe in your own community, to serve. We need more people. Maybe you're working in a soup kitchen. Maybe you're going to a homeless shelter, but you're working to try to help other people.
I love that. Bill, I could talk to you all day, but we need to be respectful of folks' time. The book is, my favorite book is True North. This is True North, an Emerging Leaders edition. I am so grateful to you for sharing with us and giving your time. It's truly a master's class. Thank you for everything you said about leadership, about capitalism, about actually being authentic in everything you do, whether you're in a for-profit or nonprofit. A beautiful conversation.
Well, thank you for what you're doing in the conscious capitalism movement. It is a movement, and you guys represent an organization, but still it's a movement. It's not just a big bureaucracy. And I think I want to encourage everyone listening in to join in that and think about how we can make capitalism much better. And that's what I think you're trying to do. We only make it better through better leaders. And I hope everyone listening in will maybe get some ideas from my book, listen to the other leaders are quoted there, but more importantly, you can decide the kind of leader you want to be. That's what matters.
Bill, thank you so much. And thanks to everyone for participating, and thanks for all our questions. Sorry we couldn't get to all of your questions. There are just so many of them, but I hope everyone has a wonderful day and a wonderful week, and bring your own sense of authenticity and your values to work. In the work that you do every day matters.